Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about prophylaxis. Well, prophylaxis, I would say that's one of the most interesting areas in chess. We can use prophylactic thinking in a wide range of situations, in the opening, in the middle game, in the end game. We can use it when attacking and obviously also when defending. If you remember back in chapter 19, we actually already came across a case of prophylactic thinking. If you remember, it was with the white pieces Ioannidis. He was attacking, but he saw that his opponent was about to bring the king into safety by king c8, king b8. And what Ioannidis did, he brought his queen to d4. From there, he was ready to bring the queen to a7 before black was capable of putting the king on b8. So that's a kind of prophylactic thinking within attacking play. But here, I would like to look at it obviously from a more defensive point of view. So first of all, some kind of definition, what is prophylaxis about? As I see it, it's about taking preparatory measures, taking measures in advance before our opponent carries out their intended plan, something like that. So we might actually let them carry out their plan, like Ioannidis was ready to let black play king c8, but we have something prepared, some kind of rejoinder, and in this case he had queen a7, if you remember. So we let them carry out their attack or their plan, but without the supposed effect or with less effect that they hoped for. So here in this chapter, I had three different situations that I wanted to look at. In the first place, something about overprotection, how we can cover important squares or pawns, areas of the board in advance before the opponent actually carries out an attack there. And obviously it's connected to where our king is. So in some way we're trying to protect that area or those pawns or squares in advance before we really face an attack at that part of the board. Secondly, I wanted to have a look at some examples where we can improve our king safety by moving the king to a slightly safer place. Like little connected to what we saw about the king move, if you remember the chapter about the king move. But here it's, linked to, perhaps you would say, it's not like it's getting checked. It's basically that it might be somewhat exposed and we will find a safer place for it, close to it, another square next to it, and so on. Yeah, you will see this once we get to those examples. And finally, in the last part of this chapter, we will check some situations where we can actually identify completely which is the opponent's next move, and we will take measures so that this or that move won't hurt us so much. So it's some kind of concrete prophylaxis, you could say, that we know exactly what's going on and we will take measures against this or that move. So let's get started. Let's take our first example, speaking of how we can overprotect certain areas of the board. Our first example, it's in a Benoni structure, as you can see. Black has played some kind of Benoni. It seems that white pushed at some point f4, and there was a trade of these pawns. Is that what's happened? I think so, yeah. The pawns on f4 and e5, they got off the board. So we have this position here in this game between the white pieces Kuzubov and playing black Del Rio. White has something going on here, as you can see. What do you think white would like to play if it was their move? Of course, white is ready to play e4. This is a dangerous move because apart from the fact that they would get rid of the weak pawn, it's not so much about that. It's about the fact that they would like to invade along the f-file. They would like to play queen f7, enter along the f-file and take control also of the 7th rank. That would be bad news for black. So what black is trying to do here, they're trying to find a way to meet this threat, because they can't really avoid e4. That's where the prophylactic thinking comes in. We can't prevent this move. We can't put anything in its way. So we have to live with this move. We have to live with it that white will play e4 and probably on the next move. So how can we possibly prepare for this move, e4? How can we meet the upcoming threat of queen f7 or the possibility of queen f7? Aha, you saw this. I think it's a well-known pattern, so I'm not surprised that you found it very quickly. Of course, what Del Rio did here, he played the move rook a7. Very nice, the typical prophylactic rook. It takes control of the whole 7th rank in one single strike. No need to move the other pieces on the 8th rank in order to bring the rook into the action. That would be like a typical way of playing, but it's not necessary here because we have no pawns on the 7th rank. Obviously, this won't work in all pawn structures, but here it works perfectly. So very nice move, rook a7. In this way, when white goes e4, we will safely defend this square. If we don't have this notion about prophylactic thinking, we might perhaps play something like knight f6, getting back the knight into the battle. And here you can see the consequences. White will play e4, And if we now take on e4, knight takes e4, they have already a lot of pressure at this knight. We can't really let it stay there. And if we take, they wouldn't take back. You're right, they would first give this check. This would be very nasty for us, king h8 and bishop takes e4, I think. This would be unpleasant because there are even some concrete threats here, I think. Bishop takes d6 and queen e8. If I'm not mistaken, there is something going on the 8th rank. So this would be very, very unpleasant for black. This is what happens if we don't really pay attention to white's threats and we don't look for a prophylactic solution. By the way, there might be some kind of discussion about what is prophylaxis, what is defense. Maybe you would say e4 is a concrete threat, so prophylaxis, it's actually not connected to some future plan. I'm not so interested in the labeling of this or that move. I'm mainly interested in learning about important ideas. So yeah, I have an open mind in this sense. If you would like to call this simply defense, that's fine also. I, for now, will refer to it as prophylaxis, rook a7 in this case. So let's have a look. There is another facet of this move which I wanted to show you. After e4, then black took on e4. We're following the game now. And Kuzubo took with a knight on e4. You can see they had no chance of playing queen f7 anymore because our rook is taking control of the whole 7th rank. So interesting at this point what black played. They would like to get back the knight into the game, I was saying, but they can't for two reasons. First, the knight is hanging, and secondly, also if it wasn't hanging, still black would have a problem with the pawn on d6. So what do you think they played instead? Any other logical move for black? That's right, they played here bishop f5. So the other interesting facet of this is that if you look at the initial position, the move bishop f5, it's actually not available right now. So you could also think of rook a7 as some kind of flexible move. We play a move that will probably be good for us anyway, so we can play it right now, and we keep all the doors open. Depending a little on what white will do, maybe they will play something else than e4, maybe in that case we would go knight f6, but here we are interested in, if they play e4, we're interested in using our bishop, so we get like a free chance to use the bishop here. So something about move orders you could say also, very nice the fact that now we can play bishop f5 because we waited with committing the bishop, if you see what I mean. Yeah, I hope this is clear. I mean, we could have played something else here, but yeah, it wouldn't be the same thing, right? Because we need to cover f7 in the first place. So that's why we will start with rook a7. And then we would build our plans depending on what white would play here. One of the ideas would be to play knight f6. And another idea, now that I played e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, we can't play knight f6. So now we use this idea, bishop f5 instead. Perhaps a little confusing, but I hope I made my point, something about keeping the ideas in the pocket. White played here bishop f4. You can see that there is a concrete threat. They would like to play here the move knight g5 to bring the knight to e6. That's a weak spot in our camp. So what Del Rio did here, he hurried up. He traded on e4. Bishop takes e4 so that this won't happen. After queen takes e4, he brought the rook to e7 first so as to avoid the entrance of white's queen on e6, and after queen f3, he simply played rook f7. In this way, he keeps perfect control of the king side. It's difficult for white to do anything in particular here at this point, and the game was later drawn. So a simple example about how we can use prophylactic thinking. We saw that e4 was coming up, there was an issue with the f7 square, so we hurried to play here the move rook a7. Very clever usage of the rook along the 7th rank. Let's have a look at another prophylactic rook, you could say, in our second example, with the white pieces rapport and playing black is Anand. Anand has gone really all in this game. You can see he didn't castle. He let white have a passed pawn, but he's building up an attack on the king side. You can see that now there are things going on the king side. Queen h5 is one idea, h takes d3 with mating ideas and so on. So what should I do about this? Well, you could say, of course, if we go back to the previous chapter about defensive exchanges, you could play something like bishop takes and play queen e4. This was possible, but I think that what Rapport noticed was that also if he could cope with the attack, I mean the attack at his king, then he might be able to launch an attack against black's king, because after all the king is like that in the middle between the two rooks. It's not completely safe either. Black is not that well coordinated, so he actually went for more, and he used the same idea, the prophylactic rook move. By now you know which move I'm talking about, of course. Aha, that's it. He played here rook a2. Very nice, because in this way the rook takes control of the whole 2nd rank, and technically speaking we're protecting the pawn on h2 whenever black tries to build up an attack against that that pawn. So very nice move in the game, and then took on g3. And after f takes g3, now you can see that also the f file opened up for white. This was very dangerous for black, so they played knight takes e3, going for an endgame. But after bishop takes c6, knight takes e4, d takes e4, this endgame was not easy for black. You can see that they have several weaknesses, and also in the long run, I think that the passed pawn that white has on this side, it's really important, it's really powerful. You can see that the pawn on d4 is also a little loose, and definitely white's bishop is stronger than black. So this was difficult for black. I wanted to look at what I think is the most consequent continuation for black here after rook a2, the most consistent continuation, which would be queen h5. So in this case, you can see that white does not face, I think, a concrete threat. Well, they do actually. Yeah, I'm wrong saying that. They do face a concrete threat. H takes, f takes, and knight takes e3. This would be the threat for white to worry about. So what white could do, they could now first take on f5. And if black takes back on g3, you can immediately see the benefits of our prophylactic rook move, rook a2. White can just take like that. This one is protected, and yeah, there is nothing to worry about, and we actually won a piece by playing like that. So after bishop takes f5, black will have to take back with the queen. And this is what I was talking about in the first place. I think that Rapport, if he had reached this position, he knew that he had an attack himself here. So what white could play here is actually f4. Very nice active move. We're going for an attack now. I think you could also play something safe, like let's say queen d5. This is also possible safety move, taking control of this diagonal. But f4 is even nicer because we want to attack black before they get a chance to like consolidate. I don't know, something like that maybe. So after f4, you can see in the first place that after h takes g3, we can safely take on e5. We don't have to care about some dangerous tactic here with g takes h2 because we have the rook ready to take back. No tactical disasters here, like you can imagine something like king g2 and queen takes f1 and h1. Nothing of that kind because we have our prophylactic rook already in the battle. So this looks very nice for white. After f4, perhaps black should take instead on f3, and here we can go for our attack. We play queen d5, so we can take back on f3, and no matter what black plays, basically here. You can see again, h takes, we will take on f3, and we have all the play here. Yeah, we don't have any big issues with black's g takes h2. I think you could maybe take it, or perhaps we could just play something like king h1 also, and we keep our dangerous attack here, and we could actually use the other rook also for attacking means if we like. Anyway, queen d5, black will have to trade on e6, and here we will transpose into a better endgame. Queen takes, pawn takes, rook takes f3, black plays king g7, and we can just take on h4. As you can see, by now it's white who is attacking. They will bring the rook to g2. It's difficult for black to survive here. Rook takes h4, rook check, king h8, and bishop g5. You can see white's point here, of course, bring the bishop to f6 and try to enter with the rook. And we have some options also with rook h3 if black's rook leaves the h file. So, okay, these are small tactical details in the end. The main point here, of course, is to understand the benefit of this move, rook a2. We keep all doors open. Again, we have this like flexibility perspective, which is often connected to the prophylactic thinking. We play this move, rook a2, because the rook was not doing too much anyway. And at the same time, we also make sure that there are no tactical surprises along the second rank. That's what Rapport play, a typical, very useful method that you can use in specific pawn structures where there are no pawns on the second rank. But actually, we can also use the same idea on other ranks. The same kind of rook move can be used on the third rank. And I wanted to show you one example on this topic in our next example. We're playing with white pieces. You can see it's a typical Sicilian battle. White has launched some kind of English attack with long castling. Black is probably going to castle short at some point, or they will leave the king in the center. What white is a little worried about here is black's upcoming attack. Perhaps no concrete threat right now, but you can easily see something like rook c8 followed by the rook takes e3, maybe knight b6, knight c4, maybe b4 can also be played at some point. So white would like to somehow safeguard their queen side to make it a safer place for their king. And that's what Kononenko did in this game versus Esserman. Kononenko hurried to play here the very nice move, rook h3. There was no threat really, but this move will always be very useful for us. So rook h3 was played in the game. If you play, it's always good to compare things. If you play something more straightforward like f4, they could go rook c8, and if you go f5, they can actually take on c3. This would be dangerous. It's a sacrifice that every Sicilian player knows about. And if we play something like bishop d2, this looks very clever, but actually black can also be clever. They can play here b4. You can see what's coming up next here, right? We cannot take because we get mated. So something like this is what we would like to avoid. We would like to take measures, preparatory measures against this kind of attack. And that's what white accomplishes with this very nice move, rook h3. So let's have a look here at what happened in the game. Black played in the game rook c8. It was interesting to notice also, I'm very concrete when I analyze games. What if they play b4? Could they play like that in a very straightforward way? Well, we could take, and in the first place, don't be too scared about queen a1. We can always bring the king to d2. It's interesting to notice that apart from the move knight b1, which we perhaps don't want to play because we don't want to let them take on e4, although now that I think about it, you could perhaps play like that also because, yeah, interesting. I'm not sure. I was thinking we could maybe move the bishop and we would have some threat like that. But maybe they will also have some threat or the queen. Yeah, interesting. In any case, yeah, this would probably be possible also. But even stronger if we go with the king to d2. It happens that black's queen is actually trapped. So after queen takes b2, I think we can trap her, right? I think rook b1 and queen a3. Rook b3, queen a1, and how can we get at black's queen? Probably going back with the rook, right? Aha, rook h1, or here I have in my notes, bishop g2, and we actually trap her in the end. So that's good to know also. Nobody dies because the queen arrives at a1. We can live with that. So b4, we'll probably take on b4, and if they take back, well, we have this nice move, kicking away the black queen, sorry, queen a5. You could perhaps even play something like rook a4. So let's have a look at what happened in the game. After the very nice move, rook h3, black played here rook c8. White played king b1. This is a good move in general terms. Now we don't have to worry about this situation anymore with queen a1, which, by the way, wouldn't be the same thing with the rook on c8, because in that case, after king d2, you can see that after queen takes b2, actually we will be in some danger there, because this knight would be hanging compared to the variation that we just looked at, where we trapped black's queen. So king b1 makes perfect sense, and you can also see that in this way, we might be able to put the bishop on c1 if necessary, to give some extra protection to these pawns on the queen side. So king b1 was played in the game. If rook takes e3, what do you think white would play? Do they have to take back, or is there anything more clever? That's right, there is indeed something more clever. We could play here bishop d2, so that we take back. We take the exchange, I mean, without ruining our pawn structure. So they could play something like rook takes e2 to get something for the exchange. Bishop takes, rook takes, bishop takes. But white would be the exchange up and have a nice endgame here. Bishop takes e4. It's true that they get another pawn, but bishop d3. I think I was first a little surprised by this. I would think that it was about equal, but it's actually not. Bishop takes, rook takes, and white. I think white very quickly gets to the c file. Now rook c3 and try to play rook c6 or rook c7. Something with an open file, which makes the extra exchange very heavy here, so to speak, even if black has two pawns. And I would also say that this space that we have gained here on the king side is actually useful in the endgame. Anyway, let's go back to the game. King b1 was played, and there came knight e5. Typical Sicilian move. You know that the knight really likes this square on c4. We saw that in the other chapter, defensive exchanges. We saw that Puranik, he took the opponent's knight on b6 to avoid his knight's arrival at c4. But in this game, white takes prophylactic measures instead. The typical situation of prophylactic thinking. I had this in the Mastering Chess Strategy course about when your opponent is about to play a move which threatens one of your pieces, you can actually retreat it in advance, which will give you greater flexibility on the next move. So that's what Kononenko did here. He played here bishop c1. It was not an obligatory move, but it's a very nice one, because in this way we're waiting to see a little what black will play. For example, if they insist with this plan of b4, we actually have a little tactical trick here. We could take on b4, or we should take on b4, and here there is a nice unexpected tactical trick. I'm talking about only the defensive merits of this rook h3 move, but we can actually use it for a more tactical purpose. Aha, you got it, knight e5. That's an interesting strike. I didn't know about this before I started checking this game. I learned it on the way, so to speak. E takes d5 and rook b3. We take on b7. This is very nice for white. Black loses that strong bishop, the light squared bishop, and they will end up with a bunch of weaknesses. You can see that even the a6 pawn will be weak after we take on b7. So that's a nice trick to know about. In the game, after bishop c1, they played knight c4, and now, finally, Kononenko starts playing for an attack. He plays here the move f4. So when he did this, obviously he had to check what happens when knight takes a3. But he knew that after pawn takes, rook takes, he would then pin the rook on c3. There are two different ways of doing it, and I think the most forceful way here is to do it like that, queen d2. Why am I saying that? Well, in both cases, black would reply b4, but here you can see that if we keep the bishop on c1 like that, after a takes, queen takes, what do you think white will play? Aha, you're right, bishop b2, of course, yeah, there was no other move, you're completely right. And here actually we get a winning advantage, I think. We win the whole rook, right, I think. So this won't work for black. So very nice setup, you could say, by white. Prophylactic thinking, the rook takes control of the third rank, and the bishop is also, it's not in the way for anyone, it was not traded by the knight. So very nice play by white so far. I was looking at something else here also. What was the other variation? Yeah, b4 I think is the same as previously. The pawn takes, queen takes, and again, you know, it's the same trick. Knight d5 and rook b3. I think most of us, when we see this kind of position, the first thing that we think of is, but what about knight a3? But then we say, oh, that's right, we actually have the rook there. So a lot of advantages with this prophylactic rook, you would say, on h3. It hasn't moved, no, and I think it won't move too much in this game either. It will just stay there. Its presence is very, very important. It's very influent on the battle. So let's continue. f4, black at this point they castled, and here white made another, you could say, prophylactic move, but I think it's not. They played queen e1. It's a very good move. It looks like a prophylactic move, but it's rather about something else. White has noticed, like not a tactical trick here. They have this knight e5 coming up. You see what I mean? Tension between the queens, and also something with the bishop hanging on e7. Right now it won't work because black will just take back. They have the knight protecting the queen. But we can use it, for example, if they play b4. Here we can actually use it. Pawn takes, queen takes, knight e5. So maybe in a way you could say it's prophylactic in some way, because we are preparing for b4, so to speak, a move which is difficult to avoid. If we wanted to avoid b4, we would play something like knight a2. I don't think this is a losing move, but it would obviously move away the knight a little from the battlefield. And Kononenko, he is playing in a more precise way. He keeps the knight on c3. He plays this very nice move, queen e1, so that we have this at some occasions if the knight was not there. For example, you could imagine something like bishop takes and rook takes, knight e5. I'm not saying that we should play it right now, but we could have it in the pocket on some occasion. Let's see what happened in the game. They played rook fe8, taking care of the bishop. Perhaps that's also a prophylactic move, you could say. They know about this trick that white has in mind. But now, since white sees that there are no real big dangers anymore, they just continue with the attack. That's what sometimes happens in the Sicilian. We make some preparatory moves, and at some point, when there are no real dangers anymore, let's just go for the attack. So h5, we want to play maybe g6 or maybe h6, depending on black's further play. They played here in the game d5, trying to strike in the center. And interestingly, white actually accepted this. They accepted the opening of the center because they noticed something. After e takes d5, e takes d5, white played bishop takes e4. Why did they trade off the bishop? Well, there is something going on the e file. They noticed that they would very much like to bring the rook to e3, and this must be prepared by first eliminating the knight, obviously. B takes e4 and rook e3. Now you can see it's a very difficult game for black, and not a trace of an attack against white's king. It's safer than ever, right? King f8 was played in the game, and after h6, white played like that, I think because there is some tactic coming up on this side, right? Black took on h6, and after queen h4, white had a very nice attack, very strong attack. You can see that they're ready to give check on h6, taking or not taking, and later on perhaps bring the rook to the attack. And yeah, it's difficult to believe that black can save this position. So very nice play here by Kononenko. I really like this example. Rook h3, it was a very useful move, and I like his further play also with king b1 and bishop c1. Very clever prophylactic thinking. And then, when he was ready for an attack, he went for it. Okay, let's continue. Let's speak about another piece. So far, we have seen the rook. I would like to show you, I think, two examples about the prophylactic usage of the bishop. So in our next example, I gave you a hint already. What do you think black played here? No, it's not a bishop move. but it's connected to the bishop. Aha, we're playing with the white pieces here, sorry, with the black pieces. White is Radovanovic and playing black is Budisavljevic. White has just played here rook d1, d3, some kind of hanging pawn structure. They are evidently trying to attack us. That's why they put the rook there. I think they want to play rook h3. Maybe they would like to play something like g4, g5. Although I would say in general terms, the absence of light square bishops means that the attack can't be that strong. If there is not a bishop on, let's say on b1, that would be a different story. No? If you add a bishop on b1 and a bishop on b7, for example. So probably not that powerful White's attack in any case, but it's of course nice if we can prepare for this attack in the best possible way and make our defending task a little simpler. So let's not underestimate White's attack, of course. In the game, Black played a very nice move here, rook fd8. Typical move, what Black has in mind here, kind of prophylactic idea that comes up in some openings like the Sicilian, sometimes in the Ruy Lopez. You have it also in these positions like queen pawn openings like the Colle and so on. Black would like to play bishop f8, later on play g6 and put the bishop on g7. If they can achieve this, it will be really hard for White to break through on the king side. So that's a very nice plan that Black played. Please notice that you could take on c4 first. This might look interesting because if they take with the pawn, you would say that this pawn is hanging sometimes, but we should probably not be too materialistic. One problem with this is that White can later on try to play d5, and then suddenly this bishop, the sleeping bishop, wakes up. There will be tactics coming up. You can imagine something like knight g4, for example, playing on the long diagonal. The pawn on g7 might become a weakness, and so on. So that should probably be avoided. So I like very much the way Budisavljevic continued the game. He played here rook fd8. White continued with their attack. They played at this point f4. They could, of course, have played in the way that we described. They could play rook h3. I think Black would play bishop f4, bishop f8, sorry, and after g4 with a plan of g5, queen h5. Black could actually use the same idea that we talked about. The threat is coming up next. We can move the knight away in advance, but we can move it to the center, knight e4. That's a good move. We're avoiding g5, and the knight is in an annoying place for the opponent. They probably don't want to play f3 because it's somehow weakening their position. So this would be a good solution here. In the game, White played f4 instead. I don't believe too much in this move because there is a big weakness on e4 and they don't have that attacking bishop to trade off on e4, for example. So f4, Black sticks to their plan here, bishop f8, rook h3, of course, you know the next move, g6. That's a very good move to continue with this plan of bringing the bishop a little closer to the king, safeguarding all the squares around the king, so to speak. Queen f2 was played by White. Bishop g7. At this point, if White really insists with their attack, they could play something like queen h4. But one thing that I want you to notice here is that even in the very, very worst case, they would manage to take this pawn. We would play king f8, and we're actually not doing that badly there. We have this kind of dragon bishop, you could say. The bishop on g7 is very strong. So in the very, very worst case, if we have something going on the queen side, for example, we could probably live with this also. But here, our position is so good that we don't even need to think about that. We could actually strike on the queen side, take on c4, take on a4. You can see that the queen is ready for infiltrating measures. We take the pawn, but not so much for the pawn itself, but in order to create counterplay. And if knight g4, what do you think Black should play here after knight g4? I think so. It's very clever to play this move knight h5. We simply avoid all counterplay whatsoever. I think there are some other options, like if you take on g4. I remember looking at some crazy variations here. Queen takes h7, king f8, bishop a3, rook c5. I don't remember if this was correct, but there was something like that, and you can see the point that we would like to give check on d4 with a counterattack, or even queen d1 mate or something like that. But okay, we're taking it a little too far. It may be not necessary to enter all this if we can play the simple move knight h5. So let's go back to the game. After bishop g7, White played here c5, trying to play on the queen side also. They're creating a passed pawn, but after knight e4, it was already Black who had a strong initiative. The knight is very strong. White played queen h4. Black could play h6, but even nicer h5. And yeah, like I was saying, maybe we don't die if they take on h7, but why allow it in the first place? h5, and if g4, what do you think Black had in mind? Counterattack coming up? Aha, that's right. We could infiltrate again. Queen e2 is a very, very annoying move for white because you can see the bishop is being hit, and we can also play something like bishop takes e5 and take on g4, something like that. So white's chances here are not exactly great. After h5, they played in the game queen e1, retreating the queen, I guess, to cover the square on e2. Black simply took on c5. Now white's position collapses now. D takes e5, knight takes e5, and black went on to win. Even in this final position, I would say it's useful to look at this bishop now, how it protected black's king. It's very nice to have him there instead of having him on this side, for example, and white's bishop would have some more influence on the battle. So very nice maneuver, something to remember, especially if you play these openings like the Sicilian by Lopez, Nimso Indians, Queens Indians, things like that, that you can play here the move. Rook d8 or rook e8. I think d8 is more precise because you put some pressure on the d file also, and then you bring the bishop like some kind of delayed fianchetto. All right, another example featuring the bishop. This time we have a King's Indian structure or a Benoni structure in this game between Novoa with white and Asensio with the black pieces. You can see that white opened up the F file. The pawn structure is actually better for black here. White has a weak pawn on e4 and there is a stronghold for black on e5. But at the same time, we cannot underestimate white's upcoming attack. So if you're playing with the black pieces, what do you think white is up to and how would you take appropriate measures against that? Which would be white's next move if they were to play? Aha, you're right. They will go for an attack here. Queen f3 and rook af1. That must be on white's list here of upcoming actions. So what to do about that? I used this example several times in classes, and it's interesting that many students wanted to play the move bishop h6, and it's actually what Asensio played in the game. It looks like a good move because we're somehow trying to trade off their good bishop now, leaving them with a bad bishop, but it's actually a decisive mistake for, I wouldn't say tactical reasons, I would say for strategical reasons, because something's going on here. If you look very briefly at black's four minor pieces in this position, I'm convinced that the most important one is this one. Black could trade any other piece, but they should definitely not trade that bishop. And probably the same goes for white. That bishop on e3 is also extremely important in white's play. Specifically because there are weaknesses on the dark square. So both sides, I would say, they should be very, very cautious about that dark square bishop. So when black played bishop h6, Noah didn't retreat the rook. He instead continued with his plan because he knew that something about the relative value of the pieces. He knew that this bishop, it's actually worth more, I would say, in this concrete position than the rook on f4. And white has two rooks, so they can use a second rook for the same purpose of playing on the f file. So you got it. They played here queen f3 in the game. And it was hopeless, this situation for black. It's hopeless. You can see for yourself here. I think they sacked the piece in the game, but that didn't make too much sense. And after f takes h64, knight f7, I think they played. Yeah, they tried. They used some tricks here trying to survive, but it's very difficult. Of course, white will not move this rook ever. They played bishop d4 instead, and black will take, white will take back. Material is roughly equal, but you can see for yourself, it's just disastrous. The strategical balance, you would say, in this position is just disastrous because this bishop is so strong and there is no black piece which can really oppose it. So this was a nightmare for black in the game. So after queen f3, we can also look at what happens if black just takes, of course. White will take back with the queen so that the bishop can go to d4. You can see that black would have needed to bring a knight to d7, or move away the other knight. That explains actually which would have been the best move for black in the original position. Anyway, let's say they put the knight on e8, we will bring in the rook to f1. And as you can see, they have to safeguard this pawn somehow, f6 perhaps. We can play something like queen h6. I was going to say bishop d4, but I think many moves will lead to Rome here. Queen h6, and you can later on play something like h4, h5. Don't forget that we also have plans like e5 and bishop takes g6. Don't forget about the bad bishop, so to speak. It's not so bad anymore if we can get e5 in. And you can see black has a big group of spectators which are not doing anything. No, these pieces are very passive. So complete nightmare, and all this explains what black should do instead. If we have such problems on the dark squares, we can see that this is white's plan. Both f6 and f7, they need some kind of, you could say, reinforcement. You got it. We should play here the move bishop e8. And maybe this move is familiar to you because there was a game, Kasparov Kramnik, I think, which featured a similar situation. I think it came from the King's Indian also. And this was exactly what I think Kasparov proposed. Bishop e8, protect this pawn and also free this square for the knights, specifically the f knight, because when white has 3 pieces on the f file, it's already going to be some danger for that knight. So bishop e8, a very good move. White could play something like bishop d4. Queen f3, I think it will be the same thing. We will play knight f d7, I think, or knight c d7. All right, I think it's almost the same, right? Anyway, knight here, and after rook a f1, we're just in time to play knight e5, and after queen f2, now we can move the other knight. Honestly, I don't think there is a big difference, but you see the picture here. Suddenly black has no weaknesses, or no targets, you could say. Everything is in order. On the king side, it's very hard for white to enter, and you could even start active operations here with black, maybe something like knight c5, b5, rook b8, b4, and things like that. So that's what could happen if white plays bishop d4, if a queen f3. If instead bishop d4, I guess now what white would like to do, they like to trade off the bishop, but we won't that. We won't let that happen. We can start with queen e7, and after queen d2 or queen f3, I think we could play in the same way. We will bring the knight to d7 and try to plug it in on e5. That would be our idea here. So queen d2, we can go knight c d7. Yeah, by the way, if you thought about this for a second, please don't do this. We're talking about strategy prevailing over tactics, winning the exchange. It's not a gain for black here, rook a f1, of course, and as you can see, we don't fall into some cheap tactics or something. We play like this instead, and again, this would be very ugly for black, this position, very, very dangerous for black, so a lot of dark square weaknesses. So after queen d2, much safer course here, knight c d7, course of action, so that after rook a f1, we're just in time to plug in the knight on the dark squares. I think black would be slightly better here. I don't remember the computer's evaluation. Maybe it liked white's extra space, but for the human eye, this looks very pleasant for black. We can already start preparing to bring the other knight to c5. Safe to say, we have avoided all the dangers which occurred in the game because we have kept the bishop on g7. That's a very important bishop. We should think twice before we trade it off. So that's something about prophylactic thinking here. We play bishop e8 so that we protect the pawn, and at the same time we free the square for the knights. It could be this knight, or if they play bishop d4, it could also be the other knight, depending on white's course of action. But that square is not for the bishop, you could say. That square is for the knights. Okay, let's continue and let's see something connected with the knights within prophylactic play. So in our next example, we have an Italian structure. You can see that from the pawn structure. And black has played in a very active way. I think we had this several times already in the course. Situations like modern treatment of the Italian. We have played g5 and g4 and h5 and h4. In this game with white pieces Abdusatorov and playing black Hakobian. So Hakobian has attacked quite a lot. You can see that the h file is open, and we should ask ourselves the usual question: what is white up to here? What is black up to here? What is black going to do here if white plays in a passive way, for example? Aha, black is trying to attack on the h file. Right now the bishop is protecting the knight, but black could try to challenge that bishop. How could they do that? You got it. We can use the knight for that. We could play something like knight f4 and knight h5, so as to eliminate this bishop, which means that we can later on perhaps bring the queen and continue the attack on this side. Please don't forget that we have this sniper bishop on a7, which means that any attack is boosted by that fantastic bishop. So white should be very careful here. What Abdusatorov did in the game is a typical, you could say, prophylactic arrangement. He brought an extra knight to the king side in order to make life a little safer for the king, starting with the move rook e1. So this is not a difficult move to make, but it's a very useful idea, I would say. After knight f4, black sticks to their plan. You can guess the next move here, of course, knight df1, and after knight h5, you would say black has no threat, but that's actually wrong, because that's the sniper bishop, right? They are actually threatening to do something here. They would like to play, if we play something like, let's say, rook b1 development, they could take on g3, or they would take on, I think, on h2. Is that so? We take on g3. Yeah, you could think of this in two ways. No, we can take first on f2, and then take on h2. But it's actually smarter the other way around, because the bishop is more useful here. We will take like that. Rook takes, king takes, bishop takes. What a nightmare for white. They are basically getting mated next time. A lot of respect for this Italian bishop. Actually, both sides are doing the same thing, but here white is having big troubles. Black's bishop is stronger, so this must be avoided, and that explains what Abdusatorov did here in his next move. He pushed in the center, he played here d4. This move is good, I mean, in general terms, opening up the game, the opponent has the king in the center, but it's also good because it's blocking the bishop, it's obstructing the bishop along the a7, g1 diagonal. So it's a very useful move, the move d4. Black played at this point knight takes g3. If they played instead queen h6, I just wanted to highlight that also. We actually don't get mated here. It looks very dangerous for us, but we can actually take this pawn without second thoughts. We're hitting the queen, and if they take then on g4, we take back. If they take now on g3, we can just take back with a knight, I think, and we have this square for our king. On the other hand, if they play here, they could play the tricky move knight f6, right? If you see what I mean. They're trying to mate us, but I think in that case we can play something like queen h3. Yeah, I think so. We win an important tempo by playing like that. If they now go queen g7, we can go queen f5, I think. Yeah, now the queen is not attacked anymore, you see what I mean? If they take on h3, of course, we're happy to go for the endgame, then we have the bishop pair and so on. So if they try to keep the queens on, we could play queen f5, and if they play queen h6, as you can see now, the queen is not on g4 anymore, it's on f5, which means there is only one threat. Well, it's a big threat, but we have time to fix it somehow. Yeah, what would we play here? Maybe we could just put the bishop on h2, no? I would guess we could play something like this, and we will be more or less safe here. It's nice that they cannot castle, and we're about to do something in the center also. So that would be my answer here. What happens if queen h6? We would actually be brave enough to take on g4, because we have seen that our prophylactic knight, it's now very useful for us. It's taking control of this square if they take on g3, and if knight f6, we have this smart intermediate move, you could say, queen h3 and then queen f5. Anyway, let's see what happened in the game. d4, they took on g3. We take back with a knight, of course. We don't want them to have pressure on the long diagonal, or, I mean on the g1, a7 diagonal. We take with a knight instead. Black played at this point queen g7. They could play queen h4, of course, and in this case you could play something like, or you have to play, I think, something like this. I think this is a funny picture. If you haven't seen this before, it's good to notice that we're actually defending against both mates. That's a very nice knight pair, I would say. In general, it's always interesting to have the knights on squares where they protect each other. It's very useful. When I play the Sicilian Khan with the black pieces, I often have knights on d7 and f6, and it can sometimes be very useful, for example, when they push the f-pawn or something, and one knight can safely protect the other one. Anyway, knight takes d3, they played here queen g7, and Abdusattorlu continued in the same way. He played here knight hf1, and now he's actually ready for active measures. He would like to bring the knight to f5. Nobody dies because the queen reaches h2. The king can always go to f1. So at this point, I think black made a mistake. They played e takes d4. They shouldn't have done that, because now suddenly white can start an attack. They play here e5. Very clever move, opening up the e file. Obviously, if black takes back on e5, we take on d4. They cannot take the second time due to the pin. So this is very favorable for white. In the game, they played d5, and here white simply took back, preparing to play something like this. I think this was an online game, and I can tell you that the rest of the game was very chaotic, so I have actually stopped here. But you should know that this position is it's nice for white, but yeah, something happened later on. There was a complete mayhem in this game, but if we stop here, we can safely see that white is happy about the outcome of the opening, or the middle game, you would say. They have managed to secure their king. They are ready themselves to play for an attack. What made their case improve a lot here is the arrival of the knight to the defense. So this move, rook e1, was very, very useful. It's a typical idea in the Italian as such, but it's even more important here since we have the open h-file to take care of. So that's how we can bring a knight to the defense in prophylactic measures, prophylactic spirit, you could say. Okay, let's change the subject a little. We are now done with the first part about safeguarding squares, like overprotecting squares and pawns and so on. And now we will talk a little about how we can improve king safety by slightly adjusting the placement of our king. In our next example, you will see exactly what I'm talking about here. You can see another Sicilian, another position with opposite castled kings. Black would like to attack on the queen side, and white would like to attack on the king side. But right now you can see it's not so easy for white to attack. The knight is very well placed on h5, blocking white's supposed attack. And at the same time, we can see that black has a simple plan here at their disposal. They want to attack the pawn on b2. So what white did in this game, Lopez Martinez with white and Rios playing black, Well, Lopez Martinez did here, he played king b1. Very clever move because he's actually sending the king all the way to a1. Then he will play rook b1. And if it's necessary, he could even play something like bishop c1. But that might not be necessary for now. For starters, this is what white would like to do here to safeguard the pawn on b2. This will be a very useful plan because that's basically black's only target, I would say, in this position. Sometimes it's actually better for them to take on c4 with a piece than with a pawn. I have seen that in the modern defense also. Sometimes when black takes on c4 like that, it looks nice to win the bishop pair, but actually they only have one target, the pawn on b2, and we can safeguard it in this clever way to bring the king to a1 and then the rook to b1, safeguarding the pawn on b2. All right, let's see what happened in the game. Rook b8, black sticks to their plan, king a1, queen b7, and rook b1. So first part of the plan is accomplished. Black plays bishop a5, and we don't want them to double our pawns, of course, so we play here bishop d2. Black brought the rook to c8, and at this point white played simply rook hd1. A very good move. They're targeting now the pawn on d6, which will actually prove to be very important later on in this game. Black played rook c5, and I think what they had in mind was to simply take on c3 and take on g5. And that explains why it's next move in the game they played here knight f3. But if you ask the computer, it will tell us that actually queen e1 was very good here. What's the point of this move? Well, basically what white would like to do here, they would like to reroute the knight to g3 to challenge the knight on h5. And if black now insists with taking that pawn on g5, which is what I think they were planning, bishop takes, we would take, and after rook takes g5, what do you think white would play at this point? That's a very good point. Knight f3, of course, hitting the rook and hitting the pawn on d6. Not a good pawn trade for black, because once the rook moves somewhere, let's say it goes back to c5, we would take on d6, and this is very nice for black because suddenly the knight woke up also. We can play something like knight e5, and who knows, maybe we have even some like mating ideas with queen coming to h6 and the knight to g5. So this would have been better. Queen e1, black should not take on c3, but then white could slowly start preparing for this active plan, trying to trade off the knight on h5, which is hurting our attack. We will, by the way, see more of this kind of blockading knights in the next chapter, I think, about the blockade. So anyway, knight f3 was played in the game. Bishop c6, black is putting some pressure on the e-pawn, white plays rook e1, and here black played a very good move. They played e5. Why did they play that? Well, basically what they're doing here, they're providing a square for the knight on f4 at some point. White played queen d1, again, some kind of prophylactic thinking. We talked about this in the Kononenko example. He placed the bishop on c1 before black attacked the knight with the knight c4, attacking the bishop. And here it's basically the same thing. Lopez Martinez knows that knight f4 is coming up, so he moves the queen in advance to d1 to get greater flexibility on the next move. And here we have a crucial moment in this game, because what Rios should have done here was simply to protect his pawn on d6, something like rook d8, and black would be basically okay in this position. What he did in the game, he fell for a little temptation here. He played bishop takes e3, and after bishop takes e3, bishop takes e4. At first sight, this looks very nice for black, because you can see that the knight is hanging, and if queen takes d6, you can see that there is rook d5 coming up, and white's queen is in some trouble. I mean, we have this threat of bishop takes f3 still. So what do you think black overlooked here? What is the problem with this continuation? What's the flaw of this little idea of taking the pawn on e4? I can give you a hint. There is a queen sacrifice involved. Aha, that's right. We can actually sacrifice the queen in a positional way. It's a positional sacrifice. What white played here was queen takes d6. Very nice. They have seen that rook d5 is coming, but they have prepared to sack the queen on b8. So after queen takes b8, we can play here rook takes e4. As you can see, material is balanced here, but the nature of the position greatly favors white, because they will play rook e1, they will take the pawn on e5, they will have ideas like knight g4 and h6, but most importantly, I would say, there is a back rank motive with rook e8. This is a rook-friendly position. It's the kind of game that you really like when you have a rook and a minor piece facing a queen. The queen is not that powerful in this kind of position. So this would have been very difficult for black. They noticed at the last moment that this was not working for them really the way they wanted. So after queen takes d6, they played rook cc8 instead on the defensive. But here, as you can see, the damage is already done. White played knight takes e5, and after bishop takes c2, white actually found a nice sacrifice here. That's completely right. There is something going on now on the 7th rank. You can see that white can take on f7, which means that the rook will come to e7 very soon here, sorry. Rook e7 is coming up next, and if black takes on b8, I think we're just delivering a mate here, right? Knight h6, and if king h8, that's right, f7, by the way, this bishop is really powerful. It's attacking, and it's also defending. It's something to remember from this example. You can see that if knight g7, we're mating them one way or another. Yeah, I can see one mate. I think that's enough, right? Bishop takes, king takes, queen f6, and after king f8 we can go queen h8, but there are probably other ways to do it. So after knight takes f7 in the game, black played queen takes f7, and white simply played here rook e7. In fact, black had already resigned on the previous move, but as you can see, this is disastrous with f7 or queen e6 coming next. So very interesting game. It was rather balanced, but black made a bad choice in the middle game, allowing white to reach this kind of situation. This was connected to the situation that we talked about, that if they had carried out their plan with rook d5, then white would carry out this positional sacrifice, queen takes, and rook takes e4. That's how the game was decided. But what was mostly important for us from a prophylactic perspective, I would say it was here from the very beginning, the king maneuver to a1 and later rook b1 to safeguard the pawn on b2. It was very difficult for black to get that white king after that. Let's have a look at a similar example with a, you could say, a similar kind of maneuver, but in a completely different kind of position. However, first it makes sense to safeguard the king side. You can see that white has some plans on the king side. There is something going on here against the pawn on g7. There are plans like, for example, queen g3, queen h6, even h6 could be considered to soften up black's dark squares. So what he did here, he first took the moment to play king h8. Similar to the other example, you can see that now black is ready to play rook g8 next turn, and it will be very difficult for white to get at black's king. After that, black will be ready to continue the attack. So what happened here is that white played knight e2. Tsonga tries to bring the knight to the attack. If they had played instead h6, you can see that black would play simply g6, keeping things closed. But maybe, just maybe, this was actually the best course of action for white, because if we consider that it's difficult for them to attack, they could actually try to trade queens instead. They could play queen g3, trying to play queen h4, and the threat of queen f6 would probably force black to trade queens. Maybe this was better, because even if the middle game will be nice for black, on the end game as well, this would be a lesser evil for white, because at least their king would be a little safer. But in the game, white went all in. They played here knight e2, and black continued with their plan. They played h6 so that white cannot play h6, and now, as you can see, they are ready to play rook g8, and there are no issues with queen takes h6 anymore. White played rook h3, bringing more pieces to the attack. Black played d4. This means that we can now use our bishop in a more active way. After queen g3, you guess, of course, black's next move, definitely rook g8 makes perfect sense. And after white played knight f4, it's not clear exactly how is white going to progress here, because we can, of course, picture some kind of sacrifice on g6, but black has no reason to take back. So it's actually like if white is in a dead-end street here. Erigaisi played bishop c6. The nice thing about this move, apart from the fact that we can use the bishop to attack, is that it can also be used for defensive purposes if necessary. So after rook g6, if white had played that, you can see that if they had some hopes of taking on e6 and playing knight g6, well, we could simply play bishop e4, and that plan would be impossible for them. So after knight e2, in the game, black played bishop d5. You can see that now c4 is also coming closer. We have rook b8 coming up. It's only black who has an attack now. So difficult for white. Maybe they should have taken on d5, but still after e takes d5, and maybe we have knight b4 coming up, and maybe double up on the b file. I think it would be very difficult for white to defend. In the game, white played knight f3, theoretically speaking, something like this. But even then, you can see it's kind of funny, but if black's queen just moves away, we could perhaps just play something like king h7, and provided that we can keep white's queen away from the light square, which shouldn't be that difficult, it's hard to believe that white's attack can work. So they played in the game queen b7, after knight h4, knight b4, black goes all in here because, after all, their king is much safer. White played in the game knight takes d5, and at this point Erigaisi noticed that it was actually possible to go for the concrete attack here to finish off the game. He played knight takes a2 check, and after king b1, queen takes d5. As you can see by now, there are ideas such as rook b8 and knight c3 check, so hopeless case for white. They tried knight g6 here, like a last desperate attack. I don't know if king h7 was possible, but it was also perfectly fine to take on g6, since after h takes d6, rook gb8, you can see it's a good rook to use because our king gets, just in case, an extra square. And now after queen f4, that was white's last hope that somehow they would get rook takes h6 in, but it's black's to move, and you can imagine what black played. Of course, knight c3, that's a perfect moment to play this move because they can't go that way due to mate, they can't go the other way because they, in that case, they lose the queen, and obviously if they take on c3, we can just take back, and they are left without fuel in their attack on the king side. So rather practical example, I would say. I think it's instructive how Erigaisi, instead of rushing with attack, you could think of something like you push d4 here and suddenly white plays queen h6 and they have some attack coming up. Instead of that, he first took prophylactic measures. Even if white didn't have like a very concrete threat, he preferred to first safeguard the king with king h8, and then he was ready to play h6 and rook g8. Probably white themselves should have played h6. We talked about that, softening up the dark squares to try to trade the queens. In the game, they omitted to do that, and after that, black had a rock-solid formation on the king side, and they were able to focus on the queen side instead. So at this point, I would like to also mention that we can use our pawns in order to help the king to reach more safety. We saw something about that also, I think, in the chapter about making space. If you remember, we could play some move with the pawns in front of the king to give them extra space. And I had another example on this topic that I wanted to show you, and it's this one with white pieces, Frederick Svanne, and playing black Alexandru David. You can see that white has a slight issue with the d file. You can see that black is already in control of the d file. This is the only open file, so obviously both sides are very worried about this file. They would really like to take control of it, but white can't do that. If you play something like rook d2, black will take on d2 and they will play rook d8. And you can see that also the pawn structure favors black a little because there is a weak pawn on c4. On the other hand, white has some chances of pushing the pawns perhaps in the center at some point, but the first thing here to make sure is that we are not getting hurt by something like rook ad8 and rook d1 check. So since Svanne can't really prevent that move, rook ad8, he says, all right, I'll try to find a better square for my king. And that explains his next simple move here. He played h3 so that the king can be secured on h2. Now, if black plays rook ad8, we can actually take a pawn on a7, because after rook d1, as you can see, we could just take and we could save our king on h2, as simple as that. So in the game after h3, black plays a much better move. They played here queen a5. They protect the pawn and they get ready to play rook ad8, and also they are improving their queen. So white uses the same idea. I mean, not using something, they are continuing with their idea. I wanted to say they played here king h2. Now the king is safe forever. It's also safe in the event of queen h5. We have secured also the pawn on h3. Black played rook ad8, and at this point maybe rook d2 is a threat to take into consideration. So white played here rook c3, active defense, you could say. Also rook a3 is coming up next. Black played queen h5. Now, yeah, by the way, they could of course land the rook on d1, but as you can see, since our king is already off the first rank, we could perhaps simply take on b7. It's not so easy to see how black will manage to continue the attack. You don't forget that we have this kind of dragon bishop on g2, which safeguards the important h1 square. So I think white will be fine here. In the game after rook c3, they played queen h5 black, and white took the pawn on a7. Now the game gets a little more complex. Black played an interesting move here, rook d1. Yeah, we talked about this before, but now it comes with a different flavor, you could say, because before. What do you think black is up to here? What do you think they have in mind? Can you see some like tactical possibility for black? That's right. They are actually about to win the game here. With bishop takes h3, and after bishop takes h3, they would play rook h1. And if we then take the rook, they will take on h3, and in the end, as you can see, they will land the other rook on d1. So that's something to take into account. And what Swana did here was very practical. He played the move h4, which means that now there is the threat of bishop f3. So black, they don't have really time for playing g5, which is perhaps what they would like to play, because there is bishop f3 coming up. So black played rook e1, and here white was brave enough to just take on b7. So interesting. They don't see any ghosts, so to speak. After rook d1, you can see that it's starting to look dangerous, but what white noticed is that they can actually bring the queen to the defense, some kind of mobilization. They played here queen b8 check, and after king h7, the queen is now much closer to the battlefield, queen f4. But black, they have still not given up their plans on mating white. It's an interesting battle. They play here rook a1. Of course, you can immediately see the point. They would like to play queen d1 and then mate white in the corner. So at this point, what Swana does, a very clever way of thinking, he enables some counterplay. He gives up the pawn in order to liberate his pieces a little. You got it, that's right. He played here the move e5. So this means that we have an extra square now to use on e4. We can bring the bishop to e4 on some occasion, and black should even be a little careful, because there might be some line where they go g6, and since the queen is not defending the pawn on f7, white could try to sacrifice on f7. So nice move e5, black took back the pawn, queen takes e5, and here white simply traded queen since their king was a little weak. Queen takes, rook c2, white is taking care of the second rank and the pawns on that rank, and the game was later drawn. So nice effort by Swane. The position was slightly unpleasant for white, but they noticed that even if they cannot really prevent the arrival of the black rook at the first rank in any good way, they could prepare for it, in the sense that the main target, the king, can escape from there. So h3 was a very convenient move to play here, so that after black's rook arrives there, we already have the king on h2. Very, very clever prophylactic thinking. Okay, at this point, let's switch to the last topic that I had prepared here. We're talking about when the opponent's plans are very concrete. We can immediately see, actually you would say that about this position also, it's also very concrete, but I have some other cases where they're perhaps even more concrete. We can spot their next move, and that's what's happening in this next example. Niemann with white and Schwertz playing with the black pieces. White has just played knight f3, h4. I think even without telling you that information, you would know instantly what white is up to here. Of course, what white would like to do here, they would like to play queen h5. After that, they will have two interesting ideas. One is to give check on g6, of course, and the other one would be to plant a knight on f5. So what do you think we should do about that? Can we prevent queen h5 in a good way, or should we take prophylactic measures, like preparatory measures in some way? It's actually not so easy to prevent it. If we play g6, physically we prevent it, but then we let white do other things. They could play like bishop h6, exploiting the fresh weakness, and later on if we play rook f8, let's say queen f3, I think that was the best move here. And already it's a little shaky here, the position. The pawn on f6 is weak, and if we play f5 at some point, they'll probably play knight g5, and you can see that they have pressure here on us, many pieces, and check there, and the knight is a little shaky also. So this should probably be avoided with black. There are other moves that you could consider, but none really that does the job of preventing queen h5. So what? Yeah, this move is also interesting. Knight a5. You could play like that also. Include bishop c2, c5. That's often a good plan in the Royal Lopez to gain some space. But white could continue with their plan. They could play queen h5, and it would be basically the same situation as in the game, but in a better version for white. So why am I saying that? Well, if you actually arrived at this position, what do you think black should play? Now we need to prevent knight g6. I would say this is not prophylaxis anymore. It's simply defending against opponent's threats, detecting the threat and taking the correct measures. Exactly, we will play queen e8 here. The problem with this is that now white can actually win the bishop pair. As you can see, they would trade off on e8, and then they would play knight f5. Unfortunately, Either way, they will take here, or they will bring the knight to d6 next turn with a fork, and this means that they will take the other bishop in that case, the one on b7. So from here, we have actually already discovered something about the right solution. In this variation, it started with knight a5, which is not a bad move, but even better is if we prepare for queen h5 in that way. We get ready to meet it with queen e8. For that to happen, we need to take care of the knight on d5. And that's what Schwerz did in the game. He played here simple yet strong move, rook a d8. After all, that rook also had to be brought to the battle. So rook a d8, clever move. After queen h5, he hurried to play queen e8. And now, as you can see, everything is in order. There is no check on g6. If white takes on e8, we take back. And if they go knight f5, we can simply play bishop f8. Unlike the other variation, there are no forks on d6 anymore. Black would have a long-term advantage here thanks to the weak pawn on d3. So nice prophylactic thinking here by Schwerz. Very precise move, rook d8, preparing to go queen e8 in case white goes queen h5, which is actually what happened in the game also. So let's have a look at what happened next. After queen h5, queen e8, Niemann didn't want to trade queens. He played here queen g4. And here black hurried to kick away the queen before white gets the knight to f5. They play here the move bishop c8. After queen f3, yeah, white is moving like backwards. This gives black a great chance here. They play the move knight f4. You can see that Schwerz, he doesn't want to play f5 yet because there is probably something with knight e5. It's slightly unpleasant with all those pieces crowding against black's king, and also you can see that the knight is hanging on d5. So he played here knight f4. A nice, you could say, disruptive move, because now white can safely forget about landing a knight on g5. Black is actually threatening both f5 and g5 at this point. So very difficult position for white. They played in the game bishop takes f4, pawn takes f4. Since now also knight e5 is coming up next, it's difficult for white to play this position with both knights being in danger. So white took on f4. The game gets more complex now, but you can see after g5, black will have a slight material advantage. Queen takes e7, g takes h4, which means that they should be almost winning here if they can just avoid any tactical pitfalls. The piece is much stronger, I would say, than the two pawns in this position, and also black has some attacking chances of their own on the g-file if they can somehow bring the bishop somewhere else, white's bishop. And that's what happened in the game. When white played d4, first Schwerz invited to a defensive exchange with queen d7. White, since they know the nature of this position, that the piece is stronger than the pawns, they played queen f4, and here clever move knight a5, trying to kick away the bishop so that the rook can go to g8, and after that white is going to be facing an attack along the g-file. So that's what happened in the game, and later on black prevailed. So this was a nice example, I would say, about when you notice, you identify the opponent's next move, like queen h5. You don't really prevent it, but you take preparatory measures so that you can meet it in a good way. I mean, that it doesn't harm you so much. And that's what Schwerz did here with rook a d8. A simple move, but yet very effective, because now queen h5 is not that dangerous anymore, since we have queen e8 and our knight is protected by the rook. Similar example, but slightly more, you could say, slightly more delicate in this game, from some kind of college opening, I think, with the white pieces Jorge Cori and playing black Santos Latasa. You can see that white is playing for an attack. They didn't castle yet. And if you look carefully at this position, you will see that they have one very big threat here, which is actually, say, concrete threat. So it's almost like the chapter about detecting the threat. So what do you think white is up to here? If it was white's move, how would they like to continue? That's right. Since they already have the battery here on the b1 h7 diagonal, they would like to fight against this knight on f6. How could they do that? You got it. Knight g4. That's what they have coming up next, trying to deflect that knight, and there will be a mating pattern on h7. So this is not easy to prevent in any way. We can have a look at first at what happened in the game. Santos Latasa played c5 with a point that if knight g4, he would then play knight e4, so that the bishop is protecting the knight on e4 if white takes there, right? They wouldn't lose a pawn. Unfortunately, you can imagine the big flaw of this move. Of course, it opens up the other bishop, the other white bishop. So white simply took on c5, and after rook takes c5, rook takes c5. Interestingly, depending on black's recapture, white would have two different continuations, both with the same piece. So how does that work? Well, if they take here with the bishop, white would then play knight g4, I think. And this would be very unpleasant for black. You can see that now we have a mating pattern with queen takes h7, and if knight e4, white would have this nice move, h6, and softening up black's position. Yeah, you can see that if g6, there will be problems on the long diagonal with something like queen e5. Yeah, this would be very, very ugly for black. On the other hand, after rook takes e5, if black takes with the bishop instead, so that yeah, what would be the difference if they play like that? Maybe something with this check on b4, perhaps. So for that reason, it's actually better for white to go this way with a knight. Interesting, no? Now we're preventing that check. And as you can see, if bishop takes, white will take on f6, and this will also be difficult for black because you have the mating threat of queen takes h7, and the queen is also hanging. So big problems for black. What happened in the game? Yeah, what did I play in the game? After b takes e5, I think white played knight c6. This is how the game went. Okay, I see. Bishop takes and bishop takes f6. That's how they played in the game. Did I get something wrong here, or was this the course of the game? Let's see here. c5 was played in the game. White took on c5, and after rook takes e5, they took with the rook on c5 again, because now they want to get ready for knight g4, so that's why they first take, so that the bishop stays on this diagonal. It's not deflected by black's rook, if you see what I mean. So after bishop takes e5, yeah, exactly, white will play knight g4. I think I got it wrong, no? Yeah, it was knight g4 here, exactly. Here this is stronger. The check is not important. We can just move the king. So this would be very, very bad for black due to the problem with the h7 pawn. And in the other case, after rook takes e7, if you take with the pawn on c5, now he played knight c6 in the game. And this was extremely clever by Corey, because he knew that at this point, bishop takes, he would play bishop takes f6. And now there is no good way of defending against queen takes h7. They play g6 in the game, and he just took on g6, h takes, pawn takes, and queen e6 with a very strong attack. So that's what we should avoid. Now let's see if we can figure out how to avoid this, how to meet knight g4 in a better way. And actually it's somehow connected to what he played in the game, because in the game he went for c5, right? And he wanted to put a knight on e4. His idea was correct to put a knight on e4, but he should have acted in a slightly more flexible way. So what he could have done here, there is a move which, if you consider that we will play knight e4 at some point and they will take, we would love to play in that position. We would love to play c5 because it would create counterplay. But the bishop will be hanging on b7, right? So that's the first thing that we can address here with our next move, trying to defend the bishop. And secondly, if white plays something like, we should not forget about this, of course, they could also consider something like g4, g5, speeding up the attack on the king side. And that is a move which can also meet this threat. So it's, you could say it's something about prophylactic thinking, but it's also about useful moves. There is some connection between these two. So what black should have played here, you got it. That is a move which combines both functions of preparing c5 and also taking measures against this move. It turns out that white's queen is in a very powerful place, and there is one black piece which is able of kicking away white's queen from there. Exactly, of expelling white's queen, rook c7. That would have been the correct move on this occasion. You can see the point here that if white now plays g4, trying to play g5, we could consider bishop c8, or we could even play our favorite move here, knight e4. Now it's a different story, because after bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, we can then play the move c5. This is what we wanted from the very beginning. Now you see it's very useful to have the bishop protected here. On the other hand, if white takes measures against knight e4 by playing f3, what do you think black would play? Aha, that's right. Now we can use the other idea. Now we can play bishop c8, and white's queen will have to move away from its prominent post on f5. They'll have to play something like queen f4, and now we can actually use the move that Santos played in the game. Now we can play c5, because now we're not hurted by this battery anymore. So they can take, we can take back, and as you can see, this is not so dangerous. That it's not really threatening so much. We could maybe use some pawn break in the center or something, try to look for counterplay. If h6, we can simply play g6, and it's also not so Not so dangerous for us. Yeah, sorry, 96, 94 we will take with the bishop, of course. Yeah, you're right. That's much smarter to keep the knight on f6. So this is a much better version of the game. Black has basically everything under control. So very good move here, rook c7, so that we get ready to play c5, and also we enable the move bishop c8, which can come very useful. So let's have a look also at what happens if white plays knight c4, the most straightforward move. Yeah, now we have to play knight e4. So it's basically the same thing that we just looked at, right? We just looked at this variation, but in a different facet. We looked at it with white having played g4. This is what we looked at recently. We concluded that knight e4 was very strong since bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, we have c5. So if they play knight e4, they actually get a better version because they don't commit the g-pawn, they don't weaken their king, and they can use the knight for other ideas like some sacrifice with knight h6 and so on. On the other hand, we can still stick to our plan. Knight e4, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and here we can push c5. This is our key move in this example. We are wakening up the bishop on b7. So white's attack here wouldn't be near as strong as in the game. They could play something like queen e5, trying to cook up some attack, but we could just expel the queen by means of bishop d6. If they go instead with the queen to f5, what we could do here is to play bishop c8 and try to push away the queen again. We're doing it the whole time, it seems here. Queen f3, and at this point, so as to avoid any tactical pitfalls with, I don't know, queen g3 and knight h6, things like that, we could play here f5. It's a little weakening, but the point of this move is that we can sometimes put the bishop on f6 and neutralize white's bishop and so on. Knight e5, bishop e7, the queen will have to move away from the long diagonal, queen g3, and I think the safest is first to take on d4. And also we add some counterplay ourselves here. After rook takes c7, we have an intermediate move. What would you play with black here? Would you take on c7 or do something else? That's a nasty intermediate move. We can play here bishop b4 check first and then take it. As you can see, also our other bishop might be used at some point in the attack after taking on c7. So after c takes d4, white will have to castle instead. I looked a little at this position. One conclusion was that we should again annoy white's queen. Bishop h4 is a good move so that the queen is not attacking the pawn anymore. Queen f4, d takes e3, queen takes e3. I think white is still up a pawn here. No, we actually got back the pawn, right? Bishop g5, provocation, so that they weaken their long diagonal by f4, and then we play bishop e7. I was going to say bishop f6, but I think actually this is stronger because, yeah, you see why, of course. We have bishop c5 coming up, and there are some ideas like queen h4 if the king goes that way later on. Anyway, these are minor details. The important thing here was actually to save the skin of our king. White had two very dangerous ideas. One was to go g4, g5, and the other one was to play knight g4, trying to deflect our knight from the defense of the pawn on h7. And for that reason, we had this like multifunctional move, rook c7, some kind of prophylactic thinking that we can sometimes go c5 after putting a knight on e4, and we also enable the move bishop c8 to expel white's queen from f5. So two ideas in one. You could say this was a very useful move, but I admit it not completely evident when you sit there at the board. And then in our last example, I wanted to show something which is slightly different perhaps from the rest, because in all the preceding examples we could quickly identify what the opponent had in mind. But in our last example, this is much more abstract. And what this is about, this last example we have with the white pieces Rachmanov and playing black is Ilyushinok. What this is about is basically black keeping a lot of flexibility in their attacking play. You can see that black's pieces are very active. It's a hanging pawn structure. White has these hanging pawns. Right now, I would say there are more targets than strengths. But in the long run, they are good, of course. But black has a lot of activity. You can see that the knight on e5, it cannot be taken because there is rook takes d2. And at the same time, they have this very strong bishop on the long diagonal. So white should be a little careful here. You can see that one idea for black is to play queen g5, threatening mate, although it can be defended in several ways. Another idea might be to reroute the knight to one of these dark squares on f4 and h4. So safe to say it's a tricky position for white, and also we should remember that these pawns require constant defense. No? So it's not so simple to play white here, and unfortunately the Russian grandmaster, he went the wrong way here. He played bishop f1. He safeguarded the light squares, but now he had difficulties on the dark squares because black uncorked a very nice sacrifice. What do you think black played at this point? That's right, we're back in the chapter about attacking weak spots. Black played here knight fg4. That's a cold shower for white after 8 takes d4, knight takes d4. As you can see, there is no good defense of these two weak spots at the same time, f2 and h2. So white had to sack the queen here, queen takes d4, and after queen takes, black later on prevailed. So what to do about this then? If bishop f1 fails to knight g4, what else could we do? And I looked at some different moves here. One move that I checked was, for example, if we play d5. It's a typical pawn break in these positions, but what black could do here, there is a tactic also, you can see it. E takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and then you will have bishop g4, no, with a double threat against the queen and against the rook on c8. However, what black would play here, simply retreat the knight g6, so that white they don't have this idea anymore. And as you can see, now they are getting ready here, black, for queen g5 and knight f4. This will still be very unpleasant for white, but it's good to see this idea, the idea of d5, that we have it in the pocket. So another move I looked at was if we could play simply queen c2, unpinning the knight from the tension along the d file and getting ready to play rook a d1. Unfortunately, also here in this case, things will be a little complex. Queen g5 is a good move, we have the mating threat, and if bishop f1 now, like in the game, okay, there is not the motive with knight g4 anymore, but what black can play here is knight g6. We already know this idea. Again, the knight is getting closer. So this looks complex for white to defend this position. So what I think would be the best move here is actually to play this move, rook c1. So that's, you could say, well, what's going on? That's a strange move. They are attacking us on the king side and we just calmly develop the rook like that. But the thing is that in many variations, the rook will be very useful on c1. So that's why I'm saying it's partly like prophylactic, but it's also something about useful moves. It was surprising for me, analyzing this position, how many times this move, rook c1, would turn out to be highly useful for white. One thing, though, that we should single out here is that it does indeed prepare some kind of rook transfer to the king side, similar to Stengrimsson's game. If you remember from the chapter about mobilization, where Stengrimsson brought the rook from a6 to g6. It's a little similar to that, but there are some other fine points here that I wanted to show you. So what black could play here, of course, they could play something like queen g5 with the same idea of threatening mate and bringing in the knight. But now we can play d5. And it's interesting, no? Now, with the rook on c1, things are a little different. For example, let's say black takes on d5. Here we have the typical tactical idea. We would like to play bishop takes e5 and bishop g4. However, before we do that, we could start with including this move, h4. And after queen f5, now we can indeed take and we can play bishop g4 and we win the exchange in that way, right? So that would make perfect sense in this position. Yeah, I was interested in why didn't we play it straight away, though? If we could also play it right now, no? That would also work, I think. And play it here. Yeah, that would also make sense, I think. So probably both ways are okay. But on the other hand, if after queen g5, white plays here d5 and black plays instead, I wanted to show you the other variation. Yeah, if you play here knight g6, you stick to the plan of knight f4. If you look at this, we go knight f3, now the queen must leave this angle. They play queen f4, you could say now the pawn is in danger. But white has a nice way of defending here. They will lose the d5 pawn, but they will create some kind of blockade on the dark squares. How can they do that? Aha, that's correct. This is not so easy to see. Queen b3, and after e takes d5, what would white play? That's right, we play c5. So here you can see first case of how we can use the rook move to our advantage. If the rook was not there, of course, black would just take it, no, with the rook. But here they can't take it. There is a pin on the b file. So it's the first occasion where this rook move to c1 is very useful. At the second occasion, I think it was after queen g5, and we go here d5. They take on d5. We play this move h4. Black plays queen g6. Yeah, now it's getting very complex, the position, because after bishop takes e5, Aha, so maybe that was the difference. I was just thinking what was the difference if I had played this move straight away. I think the difference is that black wouldn't take. Aha, black would take on c4 instead. That was the difference probably, because now there is this threat and now there is that threat also, apart from the other threats. So many threats at the same time for white to, to take care of. Not so simple. So that's why I think after the move, where were we? d5, and after e takes d5, we play h4. Aha, we first deflect the queen. So they play queen g6. We take on e5, and now when they take on c4, you can see that thanks to the inclusion of these two moves, our bishop is not being attacked. Now we can simply defend the pawn on g2. So here you can see again, after bishop f1, if we didn't have the rook on c1, that's right, then they will play c3. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that we include this move, perhaps even without knowing exactly where it will be helpful for us, but we simply know that having a rook on the board like that, bringing the rook into the battle, it will be useful one way or another. So I had one last variation that I wanted to show you. I hope it's not too confusing, all this, but rook c1, there was another move that I also looked at. It's interesting also when you analyze with computers, it will tell you one move, but you can actually feed different moves to it and see its reactions. So that's good when you analyze with a computer, not just copy and paste the moves that it's saying, but also try to check different moves, like human moves. I think I looked at this move because I know it's a typical plan in these positions to soften up the d5 square. Interestingly, after c takes b5, queen g5, things are a little different now because there is tension on the c file. So what white could do here, they can play this very surprising move d5. So why on earth are we playing like that? Well, we give away the pawn, we get some extra pressure at e5, but what I wanted to show in the first place is that after bishop takes d5, bishop f1, now we have like a different story here, because now there are actually back rank motives in black's camp, because now we have some pressure on c8, tension between the rooks, right? Which means that in some variation here, you can imagine this, that if somehow the rook takes on d2 in some variation, our queen is here, we might be able to give check on c8. Like, I don't know, I can try queen, rook takes, queen takes. If something like bishop g2, I guess this doesn't work now for multiple reasons, but if it worked, yeah, you could see the point, right? That something like this, and if they took like that, we would then have queen c8. So in some way, yeah, this is just like a test variation, just to see the point, that in some way the fact that we have the rook on c1 means that also we create some back rank motives, because the rook is there, it's fighting against black's pair of rooks or something like that. So many benefits from this move, rook c1. All right, let's have a look here at our main line, knight g6, and now we simply bring back the bishop. You could also play bishop f3. This would be a simpler choice, but at the same time less ambitious, because now we don't have the bishop pair anymore after bishop takes, knight takes. So it's okay to play like this also, but more ambitious to play bishop f1. We keep both bishops. That's, in the long run, it's better. If queen g5, what do you think white should play? How should we face the threat of knight f4 and knight h4? That's true. We can use that rook again, right? It's coming all the time in all the variations. Very clever rook is coming to g3 in this variation. We don't have to care really about any of these two moves. So let's say black speeds up the attack with knight h4 instead. Now it gets a little hot here on the king side. Queen e2 is a good move to try to trade off the queens one way or another. And if queen g5, we could just play queen e3. As you can see, they don't have time to take on g2 because their queen is hanging. So probably they will have to play here after queen e2, something like knight f5 to prevent this and put pressure on the pawn on d4. Still, you would get the impression that white is under some serious pressure here, yeah, in this position. But yeah, we could play knight b3, but the other move which is very interesting here is g3. This is like a, you could say, compromising move. It's committing move. Now there might be dangers now coming up, so you have to calculate a little. But after knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, bishop g2, white has so many pieces in the defense that it's difficult to believe in this for black. I hate to repeat things, but again, we have rook c3 coming up in some variation, and also the other typical mobilization idea with knight f1 that we saw, for example, in Schmidt-Thiel in the chapter about mobilization, right? If you remember that interesting example with the black bishop was trying to go to f3, and that was the open h file and so on. Anyway, g3, black would not take them, they would play queen h6, and here, typical idea in the positions with hanging pawns. Now you can see all white's pieces, or I mean the heavy pieces, they are all like directed at black's back rank. So that explains white's next move here. Of course, this is the right move to strike here, d5. After e takes d5, we can take back. And you don't need to be Mikhail Tal to understand that there might be something coming up like rook takes c8 and queen e8, if you see what I mean. If black plays something careless like knight takes, you could definitely count on this idea. No, rook takes and mate them with queen e8. Yeah, they won't play like that. We're just looking at white's potential here. So again, that rook is useful for trading off one of black's rooks on the 8th rank. So some kind of multifunctional move. This move, rook c1, which the grandmaster unfortunately didn't play in the game. As you can see, many ideas here. One was to play rook c1, another one was to prepare the c5 break, and we could also see that in some positions there would even be some kind of back rank pressure thanks to this rook. So it was basically good in all the variations here. It's supporting the pawn on c4 also in some situations. All right, this was a long chapter, but let's have a look, try to recap what we have learned here. In our first example, we saw that black used the a7 square to bring the rook to the defense and take care of white's upcoming threat of e4 and queen f7 check. The second example was very similar. Rapport used a similar idea to safeguard the whole second rank and specifically the pawn on h2. We saw how Kononenko did the same thing along the third rank. This move proved to be very, very useful in many variations, to have the rook there like some kind of bodyguard along the third rank to help white's king. The next example, we were looking at bishop maneuvers, defensive bishop maneuver, bishop f8. They played rook f8 and then bishop f8, g6, bishop g7, some kind of late fianchetto, very useful in some structures in order to safeguard the king. In the next example, we saw that there was pressure on the f-file, and black should make sure that the f7 pawn is protected, and also the d7 square is needed by the knight. So bishop e8 was a good move. Don't think about bishop h6. Please notice that this was not a good idea by black. Sorry, bishop h6. White played in the game queen f3, and they were very happy to trade, you could say, the bishop for the rook. So much better move, bishop e8 here, protecting and preparing some prophylactic retreat. We saw in Abdusatorov's game that the knight was very well placed on f1, safeguarding specifically the h2 squares, but you could say the whole king side as such. I went a little too far, sorry. We had the next example. This was Lopez Martinez, who played king b1, king a1, and then rook b1, safeguarding the king. It could not be attacked after that. And basically what Erigaisi did was the same thing. He played king h8 and rook g8, and after that also white had no chance of breaking through. They did their best, but it was extremely difficult to get at black's king in this case. We saw how Svane played h3 to prepare king h2. In this way, black's invasion along the d file and along the first rank was a little less of a problem for them. We saw how Schwerz observed the threat of queen h5, and for that reason he played queen e8. Sorry, I'm saying the things the wrong way. No, he said he played rook d8. Let's do it again just for the sake of clarity. He identified the threat of queen h5. He didn't stop it because he knew that if g6 he would invite bishop h6, for example. He instead said, all right, you can have your queen h5, but not with the same effect as you wanted. So he played rook a8 so that if queen h5, he would then play queen e8, protecting the square on g6 to avoid that knight check, and at the same time he was protecting the knight on d5 so that he wouldn't have an issue with that knight either. We saw in the Cory Santos Latasa example that rook c7 was a very useful move for black because it would help them to push c5, since now the bishop is protected on b7, and at the same time it enables bishop c8 on some occasions depending on white's play. And finally, we saw here in Rachmanov's example that rook c1 had many benefits, most of them hidden, you could say. It was a useful move to throw in while waiting a little for black's next move. A very important move, and sometimes we miss such abstract moves, but they can be very, very useful for the defense. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.